Hello mountain bikers, and welcome back to your favorite channel. Today we've got a bit of a science experiment for you. We wanted to answer an age-old question: just how much harder is it to pedal around a big heavy enduro bike compared to a shorter travel trail bike? Now everybody knows it's a lot harder, but this is vital, and as I said, we wanted to put some science to it. So to answer the question, we equipped both of these bikes with a power meter and we took them out on a test loop to see what the data would tell us. Now before we dig into the results, let me talk you through the bikes. In the purple corner, weighing in at a lot, we have my alloy YT Capra with coil suspension front and rear and specialized DH casing butchers, also front and rear. While over in the yellow corner, we have my YT Izzo weighing in at a lot less with trail-rated air suspension front and rear. The same specialized butcher tire up front paired with an eliminator out back, but both of these are in the trail casing. For the science part of the experiment, I'm running SRAM GX cranks with the integrated Quarg power meter. Super simple to use. Just sits there in the spindle and makes itself forgotten. And to record all that data, the Garmin Fenix 8. Long-term review will follow. The test loop I laid out for this experiment is a 10-kilometer loop that climbs about 300 meters or 900 feet in total. It's divided into 4 more or less equal sections of climbing and descending. And the interesting part is that the loop starts out with a 1-kilometer road climb with a very steady gradient. It climbs about 65 meters in 1 kilometer. And it gave us a perfect opportunity to just isolate the pedaling efficiency of each bike and see which one would consume most power and energy to get up this first part of the hill. The rest of the loop is mainly on single track with a few double track connecting sections. So 4 downhills and 3 more climbs to get up. It's fun undulating terrain, nothing overly challenging, but the goal was to be able to ride it the same way with both bikes and to figure out what the impact of the different characteristics of each bike would be. So I rode the 2 sections in 2 different ways. On the first road climb, that 1-kilometer climb, my goal was to keep the same pace on both bikes and see how much more energy I would have to use on the big bike. Whereas for the rest of the trail, I would basically let the trail come to me, ride it as my fitness and my power would dictate, and see what the results were at the end in terms of time and energy consumption. Let's start things off with the first climb. So as I said, about 1 kilometer, 65 meters of climbing, and I held a pace of 10.5 kilometers an hour. My normalized power on the Izzo was 252 watts versus 264 on the Capra. Interestingly, I had to use more pedal strokes to get the Capra up the hill, which is normal because it's a mullet bike, so it's got a smaller rear wheel. I had to run slightly different gear, but actually I ended up between gears with the 2 bikes, and I kind of fought for a while to stay up on a harder gear on the Capra, but I couldn't do it. Basically, I kind of hit my threshold heart rate much quicker on the Capra, and I plateaued out feeling quite tired. On the Izzo, I was able to maintain this steady pace, breathing reasonably heavy, but I topped out at 163 beats per minute for my heart rate, whereas I got all the way to 170 on the Capra, and I felt a lot more tired by the end. The Capra was definitely a slog. I would have wanted to shift down another gear and just take it a bit easy with that bike up that hill, but as I said, my goal was to hold the same average pace, and which I did, but it cost me a lot more. In terms of work, we ended up with 82 kilojoule on the Izzo versus 89 on the Capra. So a 9% increase in the amount of work I had to do to get that bike up the same hill as that bike, with all the other conditions more or less isolated. As I mentioned previously, for the rest of the trail, I rode it a bit differently. I basically let my body dictate how hard I could go, so I would not attempt to max out the climbs, but I'd push myself on the climb and only shift down if I had to. There's a fair amount of technical climbing on this loop, so that was another eye-opener in terms of just how much more difficult it is to move the big bike around. But let's look at some numbers first. So over the remaining 240 meters of climbing, and corresponding descending, of course, the average speed that I was able to hold with the trail bike was 12.7 kilometers an hour versus 12 flat on the big bike. So that's a fairly significant difference, and it actually translates to 2.5 minutes over the 40-minute riding time of this part of the loop. So I did 40.11 with the Izzo and 42.43 with the Capra. In terms of work, I used 419 kilojoules with the Capra and 408 with the Izzo. So there's only a 3% difference. And I kind of wondered why there's less of a difference on a longer loop. But I think it also comes down to the fact that the algorithm takes into account work done on the descents and not necessarily just the climbing as we measured on the first part. So overall, you still have to work a bit on the downhills as well. And because I did more descending than climbing in the second part of the test, because I had already measured the first part of the climb, so these numbers don't take that into account. Looking a bit deeper into the data, my normalized power was 220 watts on average with the Izzo and 208 watts with the Capra. I thought at first I might have been a bit tired because I rode the Capra on the second day of the test, but Garmin claimed that my performance condition was at baseline for both of these rides. So I had enough time to recover and I was basically in the same condition when I rode the Capra. In terms of max power, I used 702 watts with the Capra versus 660 for the Izzo. And my cadence was a bit lower on the Capra. It was 71 on average versus 73 on the Izzo. And that goes to my point earlier about suffering a bit more on the technical climbs with the Capra. I often found myself using a lower gear just to keep my heart rate in check. And that meant that I would come in with less momentum to the technical sections and get a bit more hung up on some rocks. I had to fight the bike a bit more. I had to force my way across the terrain, whereas the Izzo would tend to just scamper up stuff a whole lot easier. I used 112 more pedal strokes on the Capra compared to the Izzo. It's funny to look at numbers like this, but again, that goes to both the lower gearing, the lower effective gearing, thanks to the smaller rear wheel, but also the fact that I was often reaching for a smaller gear to get myself up the hill with the Capra. In terms of heart rate, very similar numbers. I averaged 153 on the big bike and 154 on the small bike, with the max heart rate slight edge on the big bike up to 176 versus 174 on the small bike. So yeah, the numbers they're not incredibly revealing and they didn't teach us anything that we didn't already know, but it's kind of interesting to put a little science to the suffering and see what exactly it translates to. Now, to complete the measurements, I also checked a couple of Strava segments on the downhills. Now, I didn't ride these to try and beat a PR or anything like that. I basically rode the downhill sections as they came to me, maintaining trail speed, using the bike to pump the terrain where I could, but no excessive pedaling and not trying for a result. And the Izzo turned out to be faster in both cases. The first segment I measured was 127 on the Izzo versus 131 on the Capra, with a 220 versus 226 on the second segment. What that tells us is on rolling terrain like this, there's not enough technical challenge and not enough steepness to let the Capra really take advantage of its superior capabilities in that respect. And basically these flatter rolling sections would hold the big bike back. So at similar riding effort and similar trail speed, I was a few seconds consistently quicker on the Izzo compared to the Capra. So what's the grand sweeping conclusion then? Well, there isn't one. Our goal wasn't to point out the obvious, which is the big bike is harder to get up a hill than the small bike, but we wanted to provide a little bit of nuance and a little bit of data to perhaps assist you in picking your next bike. And the lessons we learned were that, sure, there's only 2.5 minutes in it in a 40-minute loop, but you do end up feeling a lot more tired. You do end up using a lot more watts to get the big bike up and over stuff. And unless you're actually getting a reward on the way back down, there's probably no point to lugging it around. In our case, the terrain wasn't demanding enough, so the Izzo ended up faster, both on the way up and the way down. So for this kind of a loop, our choice would be obvious. There's pretty much no downside to it. You end up feeling less tired and you probably have more fun and you go faster. On the other hand, as the terrain gets more gnarly, the big bike will start to pay off. So it's up to you to choose the right tool for the job at hand. Speaking of jobs, I think I'm going to go ride one of these bikes. See you next time.